you. Let me go ahead and get started. I'd like to thank everybody here for zooming in with us today. And what we are, I'm Bob Moore, for those of you that don't know me. Good to see a lot of familiar names out there, names and faces. But I'm the president and owner of InfoTech Resources. We're a 26-year-old IT staffing firm here in Chicago. And we focus a lot on the areas of project management and business analysis, particularly in the Agile area, as well as within development and with special focus on analytics and data. So thank everybody for coming. And the reason for WindyTech is we wanted to create a user forum for sharing best practices on how to best implement some of these technologies. It's really focused toward the people that actually are the implementers, as well as the people that manage the implementation of, you know, the areas of data analytics, as well as project management and how to best do Agile. So we started WindyTech for those reasons, and we really want to thank Ken Collier for stepping up today. I think we really got a great program. Ken has a wealth of knowledge and experience in terms of these areas. And before we get into Ken's presentation, I want to introduce Scott Miller. He's our Director of Sales and Recruiting, and Scott's going to talk about the particulars of this meeting here. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, Bob, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I think we'd probably all rather be doing this in person, but we're happy to have you here virtually with us now. And as Bob said, WindyTech provide a forum for knowledge sharing here in the Chicago IT community, specifically around emerging technologies and best practices. It's probably an understatement for us to say data and how you use it has been an increasingly critical part of most businesses in recent years. And at the same time, we've seen Agile approaches increasing in popularity across the industry. But we're here at InfoTech proud to say that we've seen a lot of customers dealing with various challenges and coming up with solutions and different things in both areas over recent years. And they're certainly not alone. So we're really excited to have Dr. Ken Collier here with us today to guide a discussion that will bring those two things together and help us kind of talk through some of the issues that might come up. Ken's a thought leader, author, and accomplished speaker on both data science and engineering topics, as well as Agile approaches to all things data. He'll be discussing strategies for avoiding common mistakes in Agile for data warehousing and business specifically. And we're really fortunate to have someone with his expertise on hand for this particular space. But before I turn it over to Ken, I do have one quick note. We'll be using Zoom's chat feature to field questions for Ken throughout the call. For anybody that's unfamiliar, you can open the chat box by clicking the chat button in the toolbar at the bottom center of your screen in the Zoom window, or by using the Alt and H keys together. You'll be able to type questions into the box once you have that. And Ken will be moving through a number of different points, so I'll do my best to share the questions with him as we move along. There should be a few minutes at the end as well if there's anything we don't quite get to. So if there's any additional thoughts at the end, we can certainly address those then. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Ken.
All right, I'm sharing my screen. Do you see it?
We do have it, yes.
All right, let me make sure I see the chat. Great, nice to be with you all. I'm actually not Chicago-based. I live in Flagstaff, Arizona, which is in the mountains of northern Arizona, and it's dry and getting warmer out here. Hopefully everybody is staying healthy and well. I'll just give you a bit of my background and my perspective. I'll also tell you a little bit about who I work for, which is a Chicago company. So I'm an old guy. My career goes back to the late 80s with, there was an explosion of artificial intelligence in that decade that kind of led to data mining and machine learning applied to data, which I got into in the 90s. And that was also the explosion of data warehousing with Inman and Kimball architectures and vendors coming out with products, et cetera, et cetera. Some of you may be like me and remember those days. What I observed during that decade was an explosion of efforts by companies to get their arms wrapped around data, make data accessible for analytical purposes. And it led to very expensive technology stacks, very long-running, expensive projects or programs of work, and often a failure to deliver real business value that could really drive innovation and creating a competitive advantage. What we did see a lot of was the growth of business intelligence reporting and dashboards, which those are, I think we would all consider now as table stakes for maintaining parity in a data-driven organization. But over the years, so in the early 2000s, I started looking at rates of failure in data projects, and that was about the time that the Agile movement was starting in the software community. And I've always had a foot in software as well as data. So I was really paying attention to extreme programming, Scrum, and in 2001, the Agile Manifesto group of 17 people came together and put together what is now known as the Agile movement of the last decade. So that led me to start looking at applying Agile software practices to the complexities of data. And I really spent the first decade of the 2000s speaking, writing, and practicing Agile applied to data. And there were some complexities. My book came out in 2011, so it's a little bit dated now. What I'm seeing as data has moved from on-prem data warehousing to data lake methodologies to data lake in the cloud, I'm seeing a lot of the same kinds of patterns. There is an increase in Agile adoption, but I still see a lot of the same smells and anti-patterns that I want to share with you today. And some of you may see some of these things in your own organizations. I am currently the practice lead and technical director of data science and engineering at ThoughtWorks. ThoughtWorks is a company headquartered in Chicago. Let me click. I'll give you a quick glance. I'm not going to belabor the point. I just want to, since you guys are all Chicago based, you might want to know about ThoughtWorks. We are global, but we're kind of a small company. We do custom software development and solutions development with our clients, and we've got 14 countries, 43 offices, but around 7,000 people. So we're not huge like some of the other consultancies. ThoughtWorks, in particular, relative to Agile, ThoughtWorks has been really involved in the Agile movement since before 2001. Martin Fowler is our chief scientist. He was one of the signatories on the Agile Manifesto, and Jim Highsmith is also one of our senior consultants. So we've got a strong presence in the Agile world, and we've been kind of the pioneers behind things like continuous integration, continuous delivery or deployment, test automation, and open source contributions to many of those projects. So that's a little bit about ThoughtWorks. Now let's get into the meat of the matter. And I'm going to do this. So I've busted this down to 10 common, what I call smells and anti-patterns in Agile specifically during BI and data transformation, but really this applies to, we see this with our software engineering, Agile adoptions or Agile transformations. We work with a lot of companies that are trying to become more Agile, and our approach to that is to pair and partner with them and co-develop with them to show them how we do Agile rather than training and coaching. So these are some common things that we see across industries, big companies, medium-sized companies, etc. I'll summarize them here, and I want to point out that there's 10 of them, and we have now less than 60 minutes to unpack some of these. So I will try to move quickly without hurrying, and hopefully we'll touch on all 10 of these, but it does mean that some questions might get left behind as we move quickly through these. And I'll ask Scott to keep me honest here so I don't belabor any one point too long. So I want to touch on Agile being isolated to either project management or engineering. And these are two patterns that I'll unpack in a second here. I also see a lot of interpretation of Agile as Scrum. Scrum, if all I do is Scrum, will be Agile. And we see a lot of managers and companies that embrace Scrum, but they don't take it the step further. And I'll share a bit about what I mean by that. A lot of companies that have come from heavyweight stage-gated life cycles, software development life cycles, like well, any kind of waterfall phase staged methodology, are often looking for a prescriptive methodology that tells you when to do what and how things should go exactly. And Agile is not that. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that when we unpack that one. We'll talk about wish-based planning versus velocity or evidence-based planning. Over-reliance on specialists and how that limits agility. We'll look at customer collaboration, which sounds easy, but turns out to be really, really difficult. We'll talk a little bit about some of the anti-patterns there. Adaptive scoping is something that really is at the heart of Agile, and yet most companies I work with fail to adapt the scope of their projects to fit the time and the budget. And we'll talk about that project management characteristic. We'll take a look at measurement and what happens when you measure the wrong things. I'll try to tell you a few stories as we go along. And then ultimately cherry picking Agile practices, doing the easy things without embracing some of the harder things. So that's what we'll do, and I'll try to pause periodically, and Scott, you can jump in if you see questions that I need to answer. Sure. I'll try to take questions as we go, but sometimes that takes the discussion off in a different direction. So I'll try to bring us back to the topics as we move through these. So first of all, I'm gonna bundle number 1 and number 2 together. I often see Agile adoption being sponsored out of the program management organization or the project management organization. And often these organizations send people to Scrum for Scrum Master certification. They take, existing project managers and rebrand them as Scrum Masters. And they ask transformation specialists to come in and just enable the project managers, teach us how to be Agile. When that happens, there becomes an impedance mismatch with the development organization and with the executive and business stakeholder part of the organization. So think about all the years that we've spent teaching our business partners to submit requests and then go wait until, number 1, until their request becomes the next priority. And number 2, we do some upfront analysis, and then we tell them to go away until we're done building the thing for them. We've spent a lot of years working in that way, and our business stakeholders haven't really learned how to be Agile along with us. And it creates a real problem when we want to have frequent customer collaboration and create that feedback loop. We also have trouble when the user community is out of alignment with what the technical community is building. So I show this triangle as a way to say we need 3 parts to the entire community. It doesn't have to be an enterprise wholesale transformation. What it needs to be is a transformation of these 3 communities within a context. So maybe under the heading of data, maybe we're building some new analytical capabilities for the finance department or for supply chain or for CRM or marketing. We need to make sure that our technical community, which is developers headed up by a Scrum Master and a product manager, are aligned with a real user community that's led by the product owner. And the stakeholder community is what gives sort of the executive sponsorship and enablement to move quickly and be protected from other outside influences. So all 3 of those groups need to be involved in a transformation. It's not just an engineering thing, and it's not just a project management thing. Let me pause there. Any quick questions on that?
I'm not seeing anything from the chat box at the moment. For those, and we've got a break here, Ken, real quick. For the handful of folks that have dialed in from what looks like cell phones or other means other than video, please feel free to unmute when we have a break if you have a question. I'm not going to be able to obviously get a chat from you. So if there is something that one of the dial-ins would like to share, feel free. Oh, hang on, we did have a question come in.
So the question was, how can a PM be the Scrum Master?
Yep.
So this is a frequent, it's a frequent misconception that Scrum Master equals project manager in the conventional sense. Having said that, often it is the conventional project managers who retrain and reskill to become Scrum Masters, meaning they facilitate and shepherd the team rather than manage the project. And it's, it ends up being semi-effective approach. At ThoughtWorks, what we do, we call them iteration managers, and an iteration manager does have some degree of conventional project management. They pay attention to the nitty details of, are we on track? Are we moving in the right direction? Are we improving our velocity? But also I've worked with many teams where the role of Scrum Master gets shared among members of the existing team. So this next sprint, I might be the Scrum Master. The sprint after that, you might play the role of Scrum Master. And these are just the essentials of what it takes to keep the team protected from outside influences and also keep the team facing in the same direction. So Kay says, I find that the PM is too busy to do both jobs. What if they don't have an IT background? So Scrum Masters don't necessarily have to be deeply technical. Scrum Masters really need to have attention to detail. There's just a fair amount of facilitating and enabling that comes from the role of the Scrum Master. If a developer or a technical leader is also Scrum Master, it just means that that person can do less of the technical work that they need to do because they're taking care of some of the other non-technical work. Let's jump on. So I kind of expanded number 3 to more than just Agile equals Scrum. In the early days, Scrum was the, so Scrum, extreme programming, there were a couple of other techniques that emerged in the early days of the Agile movement. Scrum did a great job of marketing, and Scrum created certifications, unlike other Agile frameworks. And so Scrum kind of emerged as the most well-known approach to being Agile. The other thing about Scrum is that it really is pretty basic. It's not hard to wrap your mind around. You can read a book or a short article and get the essence of Scrum pretty quickly. Scrum is broken down into 5 ceremonies and 3 key roles, and they're on the screen here. And none of them are rocket science. However, it's not enough. Scrum by itself is insufficient to truly be delivering production quality outcomes every couple of weeks, which is what Agile calls for. Scrum doesn't impose test automation or continuous delivery practices or continuous integration practices. And so what needs to happen is that Scrum creates a nice structure and framework for the team to operate, but it needs to be augmented with other engineering practices, which we'll talk about in a bit. And this kind of ties to cherry picking. I put at the header of this, Agile is Scrum, Agile is Jira, Agile is safe. The reason I say that today is because over time, many companies have started to conflate tools and approaches with the concept of agility. And agility is really, really much more than a tool like Jira or a scaling methodology like the SAFe framework, if you're familiar with that. Even as recently as earlier this week, I met with a client of ours and we were trying to understand to what degree their agile approach was being effective for them. And I heard two things in the conversation. One was, oh yeah, we adopted Jira and that's working great for us, and we're adopting SAFe. And so I said, well, do you have teams that are actually functioning well in 2-week iterations today and meeting their commitments and creating production ready work? And the answer was no, we're still trying to get better at those things. We still have hangover from one sprint to the next. We still have some teams that are blending Scrum and Waterfall, and yet they were trying to adopt a more advanced technique like Scaled Agile Framework, which is the SAFe methodology, before they even got good at being at doing basic Agile. So point here is, don't think of Scrum as the only thing necessary to become Agile. In fact, at ThoughtWorks, we don't even really use Scrum language or terminology. We do have iterations, we do have daily stand-up meetings, we do have retrospectives and showcases at the end of each iteration, but we avoid anchoring to one particular methodology. Our developers also, we do pair programming on almost everything. We do test-driven development and test automation for everything, and continuous integration and continuous delivery are an integral part of every project. That's just how we work, and we avoid putting labels that align us to one particular Agile method or another. So pause there. Looks like there's some more comments about project managers versus Scrum Masters. I'll leave that for the discussion. Any questions or comments about the Agile equals Scrum problem? Okay, we'll
move on.
Come back to that if you want to. So Agile, it's not Scrum, it's not prescriptive. In fact, Agile is really, and I found this to be especially challenging in the early 2000s as companies were starting to adopt Agile. Actually, I should say mid 2000s, because what happened after 2001 was a lot of smaller companies and new companies just started building Agile into their operating model. By about 2005 or 2006, we started to see long-lived or legacy companies trying to change their existing methodologies to become more agile. And they were looking for a recipe. They were looking for a prescriptive methodology that had all the playbooks and life cycle models associated with it. Agile is very lightweight and it's very flexible. It's based on the values that are stated in the Agile Manifesto. Hopefully everybody here is familiar with those. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan. Those are the core values. And then there's 12 guiding principles that support those. And the guiding principles offer a set of guidelines for making difficult decisions in the course of a complex project. So I think of Agile as those values, those guiding principles, plus a different mindset and organizational attitude about how we approach work. So if you think about traditional projects and project management, we've tended in the past to say, let's understand the scope up front, let's fully analyze that, let's create an estimate of time and budget or team size based on this scope, and let's fix all of those things and march forward. With Agile, what we're saying is we recognize that fixing those three variables just doesn't work. What we need is to know what can we fluctuate, what can bend when push comes to shove, what happens when we uncover some hidden complexity that's going to blow up the budget or blow up the schedule. And so these guiding principles and values combined with attitude and mindset are really essential. And by the way, this is hard. This is a lot harder than just looking at a playbook and saying, here's what we do next, and we march to this playbook. However, when teams and companies and groups within companies get this right, it really is a beautiful thing. The teams are able to adapt and evolve based on feedback. They're able to reprioritize and replan continuously as needed. They're able to align expectations with realistic outcomes, and they're able to deliver successfully even if that delivery doesn't happen to match what was originally scoped and budgeted and planned. So pause there. Any questions on this different way of thinking about Agile?
We had one for the prior concept, Agile not equaling or equaling Scrum.
Okay.
And he noted that he agrees, but when companies are going through a transformation, do you have any recommendations for rolling out ideas one by one as opposed to an all at once?
Yes. Yeah, so the way that we see the most effective Agile transformations that I've seen and that we see at ThoughtWorks are evolutionary changes. They're also a combination of a grassroots change sponsored and supported at the executive level. So it's not completely bottom up, it's not completely top down. It requires a bit of work with a program or a group of teams, start to embrace the easy practices as well as the hard ones. So test automation as an example, that's not something that happens overnight, but getting teams to start thinking about test automation early leads to better automated testing as soon as it's possible within the plan. The other thing that we talk about doing is delivering thin slices of value through the architecture. So if you're doing, let's use conventional data warehousing as an example. If you're setting out to build an enterprise data warehouse or a collection of data marts, and those are intended to drive dashboards, BI reports, and possibly other more advanced analytics, instead of thinking, let's build the whole system and then start building the BI and the analytics on top of that, what we want to do is pull what I call a golden thread through the full architecture. Now, that gives you the opportunity to start to embrace various practices, Agile practices, and start to train and educate people on how to work in an iterative evolutionary fashion. And you don't get it all at once. You get it, usually what teams go through is some period of sort of chaotic adoption of new practices leading to ultimate success, but not without some friction and frustration. So as an example, I like to use, for anybody who plays a musical instrument or plays a sport that requires, dexterity, if you change a habit, if I change the way that I grip the fretboard on my guitar, or if I change my golf swing, it's going to get worse before it gets better. And that's the nature of change of any sort, especially organizational change. So what we find is that taking change incrementally and moving a little bit at a time and adding these concepts one or two at a time, using retrospectives as a way to reflect and get better. And by the way, that retrospective, I can't emphasize enough the importance of doing retrospectives. So this is where teams go, oh yeah, we kind of sucked this last sprint. How are we going to get better this next sprint? Looks like there's one more question there. Let me take a quick look at that.
I think it's ongoing discussion, Ken, unless somebody sent me one directly. But I did have follow-up question come to me directly. I think it's me only, but it looks like it's relevant to the current slide, the prescriptive methodology. Agile is a prescriptive methodology issue. And it's dealing with, I'm going to paraphrase here because it's pretty detailed, but how do you go about maintaining the agility principles that you've kind of laid out here in an environment where maybe you have a really developed data warehouse and data mart already in place, or that needs to be pretty heavily overhauled when you're dealing with large scale things. So you mentioned kind of the golden thread. I think you kind of touched on this, but it sounds like this person kind of wants you to follow up on that a little bit in terms of, how do you scale it?
And I kind of take that question as wouldn't it be nice if we could all only do greenfield development, right? 'Cause we can start from scratch. And most data warehousing work is brownfield development. Something's already in place. It may have a lot of technical debt. There may be other issues. And it's true. So when I think about working with legacy systems, Michael Feathers, by the way, wrote a really good book on applying agility and working with legacy systems, not data specifically, just legacy systems in general. What we look at doing is bringing Agile into play. I'm sorry, looks like sharing just got paused, so I'm not sure what happened there.
Looks like I still have it, unless something is.
Oh, you do?
I still have it.
Well, let me see if I can get that back, because I lost it on my end. My apologies, folks. I'm going to stop sharing and reshare just to get it right. Wow. I'm somehow in a locked up state. All right, let's try this again. We apologize.
We can always follow up with the slides after the fact too, Ken, if it's
Okay.
some sort of a glitch happening on your end that's not.
No, I think,
apparent.
yeah, I don't know. Wow. Okay. We'll go back to this. Yeah, somehow that slide deck just crashed on my end. All right. Are we back?
Yep.
Okay. Sorry about that all. So the discussion was, just around that brownfield development, and generally the way we approach that is we tackle business value priorities. So the way that we talk about something like working with an existing data warehouse that might have a fair bit of development and technical debt is to say, all right, what new aspect of business value can we deliver, and how do we use that as an excuse to either refactor some technical debt, improve the system, pull some new source data in, build some testing around things that aren't already tested. So it's really bringing those Agile practices retroactively into the landscape, and it requires a bit of well, it's sort of running in mud at the beginning. It's there's friction, there's things you have to factor into your planning and your estimating, but that's actually the world most of us live in, as opposed to always getting to do greenfield work.
Okay, and I think just start along then. Okay.
Ready to move on, or?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, we'll come back to any that we missed. Hope I didn't chew up too much time there. I'm going to combine two other smells from my original list, and that's wish-based planning versus a lack of adaptive scoping. And the way that, actually in the early days of Agile, we talked a lot about this concept of flipping the iron triangle. So those of you that are familiar with project management, the concept of the iron triangle has been around for a long time. And it's really the balance of scope, schedule, and cost. It's a pretty simple concept. It's, however, often really misused by project sponsors, customers, managers, to say, we need to fix the scope, we need to fix the schedule, we need to fix the cost. In the traditional iron triangle, we let requirements, we try to scope accurately, and then we think that we can freeze the scope in order to estimate cost and schedule. And our estimates are always almost always wrong, because there's a lot of uncertainty and unknowns at the beginning, at the outset of a project. So with Agile, we have the ability, if we're doing true production quality, shippable or deployable work every iteration, we have the ability to let cost and schedule drive the projected features. And what I mean by that is, we can say, here's the theme of this next project. We think it's going to be 8 months long, with a team of about 8 people, a cross-functional team. And we're willing to budget that amount for the value that we expect to gain by investing in this project. Now, let's get to the business of outlining the stories and epics, prioritizing those, and deliver as many of those as possible in the 8 months time box that we're going to create for ourselves. Now, that is the nature of adaptive scoping. Very few people, very few organizations are willing to embrace that approach, because there is this sense that we need total scope. And what inevitably happens is that total scope often leads to gold plating or adding features that ultimately don't get used or don't get embraced by the business. So from a data perspective, we might think we know what those BI reports or those analytical models need to do, but only until we actually build a little something, show it to our users, and get their feedback, do we find out if that speculation was correct. So when this is done well, it's really an amazing thing. I worked with one company, and I just showed the management this picture, and one of the senior directors really liked this concept, and he committed to trying on the next project that he was the sponsor for. He committed to really focusing on letting time boxing and cost, constraining cost drive the outcome, and let the scope be flexible and adaptive. And in the end, he said to me, we have never come in on budget and on time and gotten a delightful outcome that the end users really value and celebrate. And this was a director of data warehousing and data management. So I don't remember now how the scope changed and flexed over time, but the point being, we still find this sort of traditional mindset in organizations who are trying to be agile, but have a hard time because schedules slip and costs overrun, because there's a continued focus on scope only. Pause for any questions on that.
I don't see any, unless something came to you.
Oh, there was a question about conflation of DevOps and Agile. I think I'll address that here, even though it's not the topic of this slide. So DevOps, for anybody who is not familiar with that concept, the concept of DevOps emerged, actually, I think ThoughtWorks was part of driving this thinking. In a world where development is being agile and operations, systems operations and IT operations are a separate service part of the organization, there was a real disconnect between the ability to deliver, or the ability to build every couple of weeks production quality work, versus the ability to deploy that into production or pre-production environment. So the concept of bringing developers and operations specialists together and really creating kind of shared ownership and responsibility of development and operations is what led to DevOps. It's not so the question is really about the conflation of DevOps and Agile. DevOps is not Agile. Agile is not DevOps, but DevOps is kind of a necessary component of true agility. So the ability to deliver it, to deploy at any point in time, the ability to frequently deploy new features, new capabilities, that requires sort of a DevOps approach. And when I use terms like continuous integration, actually continuous delivery, continuous deployment is a core DevOps concept, and there are others as well. So hopefully that addresses that question. It's a good one. I'm starting to see an increase in the use of terms like data ops and ML ops. So this concept of bringing operations together with the development of machine learning models or the development of data components is becoming quite popular in the data world, which is not a bad thing. I just hope that it doesn't get overused to become a meaningless buzzword. I don't think I have to spend a lot of time on this one, over-reliance on specialists. In our world of data, especially data warehousing, people have built their careers around being informatica specialists or data stage specialists or SQL programmers or ER, I should say schema designers, data architects. What we really need in an for Agile to work is it's good to have your specialty skills, but you also need to have a set of cross-functional skills to be a good contributing member of a team. And I'll use my principal data scientist as an example of this. This is a super smart PhD who does amazing data science work and can really look at problems through a whole new lenses. He has the ability to do machine learning and data science work, but he can also shift into programmer mode and write really good code and write automated tests around his code, and he can contribute to bridging the gap between non-technical people in the business who don't really understand how machine learning works, and he can communicate that well. So having those sorts of cross-functional skills just makes a team more able to move quickly, so that specialists aren't having to wait around for their turn to show their stripes. Customer collaboration. I said this at the beginning, this is really hard to do well. And one of the most common anti-patterns I see is using the product owner as a proxy voice for real customers, or a business analyst as the proxy voice for real customers. It's not good enough to think that somebody can speak for the actual users of your business outcomes or business solutions. So keep that in mind. I've listed here a few of the kinds of things that we want customers to be involved in. When I have a large customer community, like a bunch of analysts that are focused on, say, call center analytics, I might invite a handful of them to be co-development partners with our team. And these are the people that get invited to showcases and demos. They get invited to do some beta testing on early rollouts of new features and functionality. They get input into the user experience. They're part of defining acceptance criteria each iteration. So they're active participants, and we have to teach them how to be development partners as well as our customers. So that's just an example of how we make that work. Measuring the wrong things. I won't spend much time on this. I see that I'm about 15 minutes out, so keep asking questions in the chat. I'll pause if I see new ones pop up. Otherwise, I'm gonna march ahead. So I was at a company back in 2006. There was a company in the Northeast that really invested heavily in Agile adoption. And this was led by the Vice President of Engineering. And the company was a company that built a suite of software products that sat on a common platform, and data was at the heart of that common platform. So 2006, they invested heavily in training, coaching, mentoring, restructuring the organization so that teams could be cross-functional, product-oriented teams. Really did everything right. In 2011, I got a call from the same vice president saying, you know, we've been doing this Agile thing for 5 years now, and it's really not working for us. And we need you to come in and evaluate and assess what's going on so that we can fix this. So I came in and I started doing some, you know, discovery interviews, evaluation. And what it turned out was that this vice president was so focused on what he thought he could do was use Agile to increase the productivity of his people. So he was measuring velocity, team velocity, as a way to say, velocity is our measure of productivity. As a result, teams started reacting by doing things to boost their velocity. And velocity, for those of you who don't know, is a measure of how many story points are delivered in a given sprint. And velocity is, in particular, it should be an internal team metric for measuring whether they're improving their pace. So it's really a team metric, not a management metric. So teams started behaving in ways that you might expect when your manager or your vice president, your boss's boss's boss starts measuring velocity. They started cutting corners. They quit testing, they quit documenting, they quit refactoring as they went, and they boosted their velocity, but the code was crappy, the customer complaints went up, the ability to deploy or to ship new software went down. Everything went in the wrong direction except the number, the velocity number. So we had to have a hard discussion, and this guy was not too thrilled to hear that outcome. But that's the summary of the story, is that you get what you measure. If you measure the right things, you'll get the right outcomes. And for what it's worth, it really should be about value delivered and quality delivered. Cherry picking Agile practices. I think this is our last smell. So feel free to jump in with questions about any of the 10. I alluded to this throughout the discussion. It's easy to hold daily stand-up meetings. It's easy to carve up your calendar in 2 weeks, every 2 weeks, and call those things sprints. It's easy to put your user stories and epics up on a card wall and move them across the wall as things get done. What other things do you find in your world that are easy practices? Doesn't take a lot of new discipline. So just put them up in the chat. Think about the things in your world that are just easy adoption of Agile. While you're doing that, I'll jump over to the hard parts. So it's hard to do pair programming. It's hard for a lot of organizations to even understand the importance and benefit that pair programming gives. So a lot of companies say, well, yeah, we heard about pair programming, we're not going to do that. It's hard to adopt test-driven development or even test automation practices. In data especially, because there aren't a lot of really good data testing frameworks like there are for software testing. It's hard to adopt evidence-based planning or velocity-based planning. In other words, planning and committing for what you know you can accomplish rather than overcommitment and hangover. The kinds of things that we see, I see a lot of are teams that, when I ask them, when was the last time you met all of your commitments in a sprint and you were ready to deploy, or you did deploy the new things into production? Often I'll hear back, oh, we've never been able to do that. We've either never been able to actually deploy or be ready to deploy, or we've had some sprint hangover of unfinished work. When that becomes an acceptable behavior, all ability to project the outcome is lost. You just basically have a long tail of unfinished business that either gets put back on the backlog or it clogs up the next sprint because it just carries over to that next sprint. Just the hard practices are they're there for a reason, and they're important to embrace for a team. So managers in the room, give your team latitude to learn some of these harder practices. In the early stages of a project, give the team room to stand up test automation frameworks and continuous integration servers. Those things are important. If you invest in those up front, they pay off in dividends later on in later sprints, because you start to be able to regularly deploy, evolve, and adapt to feedback and be ready to ship at any time, or I should say go to production at any time. Again, we're talking data here, but we could also be talking about software. These same things apply. I didn't see anything coming up in the chat. Anybody have anything to add to the easy list or the hard list? Because there's more. Pointing and demos. It's hard to co-locate teams. Oh, that's a good one. Co-locating teams. One of the things that we talked about really heavily in early day Agile was the importance of face-to-face communication. Well, guess what? Especially now in these COVID times, we don't get co-location. We don't get face-to-face communication. We do have Zoom or Teams or WebEx or whatever. The co-location of people is very difficult. It takes some new kinds of disciplines to have virtual co-location, we call it. True vertical story slicing. So really understanding how to deliver from end to end in your architecture in thin slices. That's hard, because it's hard to get product owners and customers to understand that a thin slice doesn't have to mean it's fully mature, fully baked. It just means that we're making forward progress and we're showing incremental value as we go. Good grooming of the backlog, that does take discipline. And that, by the way, is something that a good product owner should be effective at. On the easy side, pointing and demos. So I'm glad that Linda thinks that story points are easy. That sometimes becomes a complicating problem when teams don't get regular, how do I want to say this, consistent at their story point estimations or story pointing practices. There's a whole movement within the Agile circle of not estimating at all. Just making a commitment to how much work the team is able to do without actually putting numbers on. There's a big debate about whether that's effective or not, but I've seen teams be highly effective in that. Hard, moving from dedicated QE to TDD. Oh yeah, so you're right, especially when we're talking system level quality assurance. So traditional data testing it's generally been a tail end activity. It generally means testing end to end through the entire pipeline of data, whether it be a ETL pipeline or a event-based data in motion kind of environment. So you're right, and it requires a different set of skills. It also requires driving testing down to the foundational step of unit level testing and test automation first, and then integration tests, and then ultimately system testing becomes a higher up on the testing pyramid. So those things are difficult. And by the way, I think it was Scott Ambler, who some of you may know from the Agile world of data. He said one time, you don't become Agile, you continue becoming more Agile. So I see that being true with all teams that I've worked with, whether they be long running teams or short running teams. Anything else? Okay, so that is that's the 10 smells. I'm curious, with the few minutes that we have left, I wish I could say show of hands, but I can't really say that. I'd love to hear how these resonated with you. Are you seeing, say, all 10 of these in your organization? Are you seeing a handful of these? Are you seeing your organization getting better at these? Are you new to Agile and you're just waiting to see how it plays out? Be interested to know.
And for those of you who are in data-centric roles, whether it be a hands-on developer or otherwise, do you see different parts of this within your group, whereas other parts of the organization maybe deal with other issues?
I'm not seeing a bunch of responses. Are there any other questions that we missed along the way, Scott?
Not that I received. I think we did. I think we hit all of them along the way here. Going through my list here. Bear with me.
So I was skeptical that we could get through all 10 of these in an hour, but we managed.
I think the pacing went pretty well, Ken. Unless there's anything last minute here. Oh, here we go. Yeah, there's a couple of people commenting that it sounds like things were spot on. So you may have just covered everything they needed to hear, Ken.
Well, I wish you the best. I know what the Agile journey feels like. I've worked with a number of different companies and I've been on a number of different Agile teams. It's a beautiful thing when it works well, and it's a frustrating thing when it doesn't. So hang in there. I think Agile is hard to understand. I mean, it's easy to understand. It's hard to do really well, and there's a lot of things to think about. So best wishes and stay healthy.
Certainly. Thanks again, Ken. Like I said, I think we covered a lot of ground here, and it sounds like we're going to get some good feedback following. But for those of you who are still on the line, we're looking for any feedback or ideas on future events or this current topic to let us know, what you want to see, what you thought you got out of this particular. Please feel free to send emails to Bob Moore or myself. That's Bob Moore, BOBMOORE at itresources, that's plural.com, and Scott Miller at itresources.com. Again, we're always looking for that feedback, whether right now or after the fact, as well as any ideas, potential hosts for future meetings when we get around to being back in person again. But again, thank you very much again for your time, Ken. I think this went really well.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.